the president of Iran has been involved in a helicopter crash. Is this the work of Western intelligence agencies? I think the answer is no. And I'm going to show you my exact logic here, but it still means some turmoil ahead for Iran. Let's get into it. Okay. The overall story here, search and rescue efforts are underway for a helicopter carrying Iran's President Raisi, which had suffered a crash landing. It says at least 40 rescue teams have been deployed, but harsh weather and heavy fog make it difficult for them to even reach the crash site. So nobody right now really knows the state of the crew and the president. But what's interesting is in breaking news, a senior Iranian official said that 2 people from the helicopter flight did make contact with a rescue team, likely over a cell phone. So what I find interesting is that the helicopter had, quote, a crash landing. Some people are reporting it as a hard landing. And this is a really meaningful distinction, right? Because if you look at, for example, a aircraft downing that was definitely the work of a intelligence agency or a government, you look at something like the Wagner Group head Evgeny Prigozhin's death last year, in which his aircraft was shot down by a Russian surface-to-air missile or possibly an explosive planted within the plane itself. This is different because generally those planes don't land. They don't have a hard landing. It's just, it's not a crash landing. It's just a crash. The condition of the president is unclear, but late Sunday afternoon, the vice president, Mohsen Mansouri, reported that 2 people from the flight had made contact with the rescue team, but it was not clear whether Raisi was one of those 2 passengers. This is interesting because the fact that there were 2 survivors in a helicopter crash implies that it was not that bad, right? Again, look at something like the aircraft crash that took out Prigozhin. This is something where the detonation was done at a high altitude, and that fall ensured there were no survivors. Of course, this is from Iranian state media, so you have to, take things with a grain of salt. But the commander of the East Azerbaijan army said a signal from the helicopter and the cell phone belonging to one of the crew members was received minutes ago. So it implies that someone is at least pinging cell phones in the area. Again, that's a far cry from saying, hey, we have a signal from the helicopter, likely some kind of transponder, and a cell phone that's at least been turned on. That sort of implies that someone is at least conscious and moving. But it could even be as simple as some sort of automatic ping of a cell phone. Now, here's the real story, right? What I think is most interesting is that the Iran's foreign minister was traveling in a helicopter along with East Azerbaijan's governor and Raisi's security detail. State TV said the helicopter belonged to the Iranian Red Crescent, which the Iranian interior minister said was part of a larger convoy. This is kind of interesting that the larger convoy did not land with the president, instead allowing that helicopter to go down, which is kind of bizarre. But the idea that rescue groups are moving toward the site, but due to fog and bad weather, it could take time to reach the area. It could literally be that the weather was so bad that the convoy may not have realized that the president's helicopter had fallen out of the formation. Again, in bad weather, you probably don't want your aircraft flying too close to one another. But the interesting part is that the Raisi himself, you can see some of the pictures of conditions here, really difficult. I mean, here you could be within 100 meters of the crash site and not know that you're there. So very, very difficult conditions here. But I want to look at who Raisi is. Okay, so here's why I don't think this is the work of an intelligence agency. Number one, intelligence agencies have a very proven methodology for taking out assassinating individuals on aircraft. And aircraft are a really effective way to take out unwanted individuals, because when you reach a certain altitude, the odds of survival drop to 0. So generally the MO is to plant an explosive on the aircraft damage the aircraft in a way that ensures it cannot continue into flight, and then take them out. And this is actually relatively tough. It's somewhat tough to do in a helicopter because if the helicopter engine loses power, the momentum of the rotors rotating will ensure that it doesn't plummet to the ground, that it actually lands relatively softly. So it's actually fairly tough to do that. You have to destroy the rotor itself in an explosive. But of course, you have a bunch of people trapped in a small area. So even if the helicopter is destroyed, a bomb may still prove able to take out the crew itself. Okay, so the fact that this has occurred and that there are survivors says this probably wasn't a deliberate assassination attempt. The other thing is that the conditions are just right for a helicopter helicopter mechanical issue. You might remember the death of Kobe Bryant. Kobe Bryant. He was killed 4 years ago in a helicopter crash in Calabasas, where the weather conditions were actually found to be relatively poor. And let's see if we can find the details here. Right, visibility was good on takeoff and flying under visual rules, but they were flying through clouds and likely encountered serious issues, right? And you can see that they were flying through a cloud layer that extended quite a ways, blinding the helicopter pilot and creating conditions for the crash. And when you look at some of these photos, again, you can see that in the crash that Kobe Bryant was in, the ground conditions were actually relatively clear. It was the airborne conditions where there was cloud cover. Here you can see these conditions are absolutely awful. And this is not something that intelligence agencies can control. They cannot control the weather. And so it just simply makes sense that this would occur in the face of really poor weather conditions. Now, that doesn't mean, though, that intelligence agencies aren't rooting to see something bad happen to Raisi. Why is that? Well, Raisi is kind of, by Western standards, a real piece of garbage. Why do I say this? Well, you know it's bad because Raisi was one of the a judicial official in the Iranian, dating back to at least the 80s, where he was part of what was called the so-called Death Committee, which got its name because the committee was known for handing down sentences to political prisoners, and he himself passed down a sentence to kill thousands of political prisoners. Some estimates put the number of prisoners killed under his judicial watch as over 30,000. Prisoners were literally loaded into forklift trucks in groups of 6 and hanged from cranes every half hour. So an absolutely eye-watering level of death inflicted upon people who he deemed not sufficiently right-wing for his liking, right? Majority of those killed were supporters of the People's Mujahideen of Iran. Those supporters from some other leftist groups were also executed as well. According to Amnesty International, he killed, quote, thousands of political dissidents were systematically subjected to enforced disappearance. It's not really disappearance if you're publicly hanged, but the point remains, in Iranian detention facilities and then extrajudicially executed by order of the supreme leader of Iran and by extension, Raisi, subjected to cruel torture and inhumane treatment. And obviously, in Iran, that gets you promoted to the successor of the supreme leader. In the 2017 presidential election, he was elected in the 2021 presidential election, where the election had a less than 50% turnout. 63% of those voters went to Raisi. But out of 30 million votes, almost 4 million, so about 15%, were not counted because they were blank or protest votes, people who felt that their ability to freely vote had been curtailed. And that's not just them hand-wringing. According to many observers, the presidential election was rigged in favor of Raisi. This is because about 600 candidates raised their hand and asked to run, of which only seven men were approved a month before the election by 12 unelected theologians called the Guardian Council. The Guardian Council, of course, has a final decision on candidate validity based on, quote, the strength of the candidate's qualifications. Then of those, 3 of those 7 candidates were then subsequently polled by the Guardian Council, meaning that there were only 4 candidates of the original 600 that asked to run that actually were on the ballot going into polling day. Of course, before he withdrew, the only reformist candidate, Mossad Mehazralde, hinted that the vote would be a foregone conclusion, saying during a candidates' TV debate, the ruling clerics had aligned, quote, the sun, moon, and heavens to make one particular person the president. And according to The Economist, the former president of Iran himself, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, was actually among those barred from running, right? So clearly, the candidates' qualifications that the Guardian Council is looking for don't include job experience because this is someone who literally did the job before. And he himself said in a video message, again, a previous president, he said he was not going to vote, declaring, quote, I do not want to have a part in this sin. So it's fair to say that this dude had his friends from the Guardian Council, all of these other theologian, they call them jurist and theologian, right? So like religious judges, all his buddy religious judges rigged the election so that he would win. And he did exactly what you would expect an asshole of this caliber to do. He, of course, said that his number one goal was to get the U.S. sanctions on the country lifted. But, of course, he also is no fan of LGBT people, saying that same-sex relations are, quote, savagery, presided over a crackdown on women's rights. Said women's rights are God-given, which, of course, to him includes things like the right to be subordinate to your husband. And, right, he mentioned in many spaces women's role-playing is empty and women's talent, creativity, and initiative can be used a lot, right? But this is just a lot of nonsense because, again, as a jurist, he very clearly indicated that he has a traditionally Islamist view of women. So this is somebody who also, of course, presided over a massive escalation in Iranian aggression. And again, in April 2020, he threatened Israel, engaged in Holocaust denial, pretty standard stuff, strengthened his relationship to Bashar al-Assad, and just generally ramped up the escalation of Iranian aggression in the region. So there's no shortage of people that want this dude gone. But the problem is, of course, sometimes the universe just gives you what you want. And if you're an Israeli or American intelligence agency, I think that's what happened here. Right? Never underestimate the ability of reality to sometimes break in your favor. And this, if he is indeed gone, it is a lucky day for them. But I'm somewhat suspicious. I think there's a pretty good chance, given that he landed in a helicopter, given that at least there were some survivors, it implies that he is likely alive, at least for the time being. Again, temperatures in the high mountains probably got into the low teens Fahrenheit. So it was likely an extremely cold and dangerous night that would be life-threatening. Again, it seems, though, much more likely that he is alive. And if he's found in the next 24 hours, my bet is he will come back and undoubtedly argue that he is divinely protected, even though, again, sort of weird, because if God really wanted you to, if God was divinely protecting you, he just wouldn't have crashed your helicopter in the first place. But never underestimate the ability of a theologian jurist to reinterpret reality to suit their needs. Anyway, guys, that's all I had for you. Thanks so much to all the members of combatvetnews.com. And be sure to like the video if you're into this kind of content and analysis. And I will see you guys in the next one. Cheers.